This is going to be a critique of an article I read on Alternate that I'll put a link to. The title of the article is The Libertarian Con, Favorite Rebel Ideology of the Ruling Class by a gentleman by the name of Connor Kilpatrick. And I have to say, just to be really brief, and I'll quote extensively from the article here in a second, that this is one of the most absurd strawmen I've ever seen made of libertarianism. And on top of that, the arguments leveled against the strawman are so pathetic that the illusory fake libertarianism that he talks about is actually at the very least not disproven and maybe even proven by his own arguments. So this guy self-describes as being, quote, red. So what exactly he would mean by that is not clear, other than he thinks the Democrats are very moderate. Let me just jump right in here. It said, this is kind of a quote to say how people would become libertarians. Republicans freak you out, but think Democrats are wimp, you must be a libertarian. I don't know anybody who's a libertarian because they think Democrats are wimps. I do know quite a few who believe that Republicans are freaks, but the two don't necessarily follow. Libertarians tend to not be very bellicose at all, so how they would characterize Democrats as wimps, I'm not sure, other than when it comes to principle, which is true for both parties. Here's one, and this is kind of like the central premise of his entire argument that he never backs up. With such a bleak economic forecast for the millennials, it shouldn't surprise anyone that our elites want to make libertarianism shorthand for political disaffection. And one of the big problems here is he never actually defines what the elites are. As the title, the title says ruling class. He uses elites, ruling class interchangeably. Apparently, the premise here is that libertarianism is just a fake thing promoted by the elites or the ruling class. Now, oddly, he never mentions the pair that are almost always cited as being representative of that, and that is the Koch brothers. Their name never appears. It's never alluded to even. Beyond those two, it's not clear to me how anybody in the elite or the ruling class, or anybody who could be called that, promotes libertarianism, except perhaps in the most vague rhetorical sense. If you read the article, it does appear that he means the Republicans, who apparently are the ruling class, despite the fact that they don't hold the presidency or the Senate. I would agree. I think that they are the ruling class, but so are the Democrats. However, I don't see how either of them are promoting libertarianism. If he's referring to somebody else, one of the conspiratorial, like the Rockefellers or the EU or the UN, he doesn't say. I don't see how any of them promote libertarianism, except perhaps, I mean, Barack Obama will give speeches while he'll mention freedom. So unless that counts as pimping libertarianism, I don't see how anyone does it. Now, this next point is something that he raises, and it occupies the bulk, or at least a large portion of the rest of his article. Quote, a couple of months ago, after Harvard released a poll on the political views of millennials, libertarians took to the internet to tell the world how the youth of America were little more than giant anarcho-capitalist sleeper cell, ready to overthrow the state and privatize the air supply at a moment's notice. So I took to look at the poll numbers, and you know what? It's utter horseshit. I have never heard of this. Libertarians tend not to very often cite polling data, and when they do, it's never to prove their point. And this is kind of where the straw man here, because then he goes on for several paragraphs to talk about going over the numbers, and and basically alleging, well, look, people aren't really libertarians. I think libertarians realize that most people are not libertarians, including the youth. There certainly is been a huge growth in the number of libertarians, but it's not any kind of majority. Cato and Reason sometimes have come out and made estimates that are like 10%, 14%, stuff like that, but I think those are pretty fallacious estimates. But nobody ever tries to prove libertarianism by citing poll data. And so to attack that poll data is not to discredit libertarianism. It's perhaps an effective way to discredit maybe an argument of some libertarians who use poll data to prove their point, but I don't know of any libertarians who do that. Typically it's the left, especially, but also the right, who like to use poll data. And he does this quite a bit where he says, well, most Americans want this and most Americans want that. And I think I'll just go into right here. The idea that because a poll indicates people want something is not proof for a couple of reasons. One, it's very possible people may want stuff that's not in their own best interest. Now, I believe in subjective value and mutual exchange and all that. But if you're a liberal, obviously you believe that people don't know what's in their best interest, and that the fact that they may choose to do something, including vote a certain way on a poll, doesn't actually make it true. For instance, they may want to eat salts or sugars or own a gun or go to church or any number of other things that liberals find detestable. And we could have polls that show the majority of people believe in all sorts of things that are demonstrably false, including from a left perspective, and that doesn't prove anything. I mean, another thing with these polls, Frank Luntz, the famous Republican pollster, has said that you can get polls to say anything you want. He can have the same person be for or against anything based on he words the question most of the time. And there's actually a good video of the Penn Teller Show bullshit where they interview him about that, and he actually demonstrates that ability. One thing the polls never take into account, though, is costs. So if they were to go around saying, do you want free health care? Most people are going to say yes, but you'll never ever get, quote, free health care. There's always going to be a cost. And so if, say, the cost of universal health care was a, I don't know, 10% increase in taxes, and so you, instead of saying, do you want free health care, but rather, would you rather pay 10% more in taxes to get health care, the numbers all of a sudden change dramatically. And this is very true, like when they do surveys about making like conditions better in so-called sweatshops. They'll go, if they ask, do you want paid vacation? Do you want higher wages? Do you want better working conditions? Do you want, health care? The employees always say yes, but then if you say, okay, if you calculate how much that stuff would cost, if you say, okay, would you like to have paid vacations if you got paid 10% less over the year? Would you like health care included in your benefits if you got a pay cut of so much percent? Then all of a sudden the poll completely reverses. And so anyone who thinks that they're being really clever here by using poll data is just silly. And people vote in polls differently than they do in real life. It's not the same thing. Okay. Okay, it says more millennials identify as liberals than conservatives. Hardly any of them, 10%, support the Libertarian embrace Tea Party. About 3/4 say they despise congressional Republicans. Well, so he's conflating blatantly here Republicans and Libertarians as if there's no difference. So what if a lot of people don't like Republicans? Libertarians don't like Republicans either. This is just sheer conflation on his part. Nearly 2/3 of millennials, again, voted for Obama in 2008. So you'll half approve of him now. Nearly 3/4 of millennials hate congressional Republicans. He repeated that twice. I guess that's a super valid point. 55% trust the U.S. military, one of the largest state socialist programs in the entire world. Also responsible for, those wars that libertarians supposedly hate. Who the fuck does he think he is to say libertarians supposedly hate the wars? Libertarians do hate the wars. And at some point in the article, he starts to say, where'd they all go? Where'd all those fucking liberals go? The wars are still going on, have been expanded, and have become even more dubious in terms of legal problems, with Obama overtly assassinating American citizens without even charging them with crimes. Not to mention indefinite detention, torture, Guantanamo Bay, whatever. But the anti-war movement on the left is gone. It never left with the Libertarians. Libertarians are still opposed to it. They're the only people who have been significantly opposed to it. 55% trust the military. So what? This is, again, attacking the idea that the entire premise of libertarianism is supported by saying that the majority of people in some poll are libertarian. No, the arguments for libertarianism are not based on some poll. So critiquing the poll is completely absurd. Okay, here we go. For almost 2 decades, roughly 2/3 of the American public have supported what we'd call a moderate European welfare state, putting the average U.S. citizen significantly to the left of the Democratic Party, and center to center-right organizations saddle much to their dismay with the perpetually disappointed center-left constituency. Ignore that last part. I just put it all there for. This is kind of interesting because later he'll say he kind of defends the premise that libertarians are Republicans because he'll say they overwhelmingly support Republicans, hence they must be Republicans. I don't know where he gets the overwhelmingly they support Republicans, because most libertarians either will not vote or they will vote for the Libertarian Party candidate, which is always an option, or if they do vote for a Republican, that's not necessarily the same thing as wholeheartedly endorsing them. This is a premise in here that he never talks about, but the idea that if someone votes for somebody, then that means a wholehearted endorsement of everything they may or may not stand for is patently absurd. We don't know why people vote for who they vote for, what they expect out of them. They could definitely be a lesser of two evils scenario. Also, this is interesting. He chides the Democrats for being too far to the right and that most people want European socialism, and yet they still vote for Democrats, and Democrats are not European socialists. They're center moderate, according to this guy. So if libertarians are actually Republicans because they vote for Republicans, then aren't Democrats not really to the left of Democrats if they vote for Democrats? I mean, he has polylogism here, which is not surprising for somebody in his political orientation, where if somebody votes for a Republican, or for whoever a libertarian votes for, that means they wholeheartedly endorse. But when a leftist votes for a Democrat, that's not a wholehearted endorsement. That is some kind of indication that they really want something other than what the Democrats are offering, and they just can't get it. The other thing here is the idea that the public wants a European-style welfare state. The European welfare states aren't all the same. And beyond that, Americans tend to not know anything about any of them. Most of them can't find these places on a map. They don't know their capitals. They don't know their system of governments. They don't know the heads of the governments. They don't know what parties are in them. They don't know the dynamics of those parties. They don't know the workings of the infrastructure of say the universal health care or the education. They don't know anything about any of that, and neither does this author. Now, if you just, again, ask people, do you want free healthcare? Do you want free infrastructure? Would you like to have free education? Everyone will say yes, but they're not free. You get taxed for those. I have subscribers from many of these moderate European welfare states, and if any of them watch this, please comment and assent to this in the comments. I was just talking to one of them from Denmark, which he references in a laudatory way several times, and in Denmark, they have basically a tax rate, when it all boils down, to about 2/3 of your money goes to taxes. 2/3. 66%. And that's not for the rich. That's not for the over 250,000. That's for everybody. Everybody who makes any money. I mean, any money. That's what they pay. Now, if you went to an American and said, would you like to have a European-style welfare state, and in return you have to pay 66% taxes, I don't think it would ever fly. And I don't think the politicians think it would ever fly either, because that's why they don't raise taxes. They tend to inflate the currency instead. Okay. Then he says the ruling class would never allow wealth redistribution to happen over here. The ruling class has been promoting and getting as much redistribution over here as they possibly could for years and years and years. It is absolutely asinine to be pretending like we don't have wealth redistribution in this country. I've heard Europeans tell me, like in having debates with Swedes or Norwegians, that, oh, in America, the government doesn't have any welfare. Bullshit. Well, the government subsidizes student loans, either directly or indirectly by giving loans, giving grants, including to people who are homicidal maniacs, apparently. They give just grant funding to schools. They pay people not to work. They pay people who are unemployed. They pay people who are single moms. They give grants left, right, center, to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. There's Medicare, there's Medicaid, there's Social Security. He references of these things later, and it's interesting. So on the one hand, he'll pretend like this doesn't happen in the United States. On the other, he'll laud this as what's great about the United States. So make up your damn mind. You can't at one stage attribute the United States as not having any wealth redistribution and something that the elites will never allow, and then laud the United States for having those things. The ideology of progressivism has been a powerful political force in the United States since, at the very least, the turn of the 20th century back in 1900. It had roots going back even further, but that's when it became powerful nationally. It's been powerful ever since then. There have been reactions against it. All of them have been weak compared to, so there was a New Deal, there was a reaction against it, but it never got back to the way it was pre-New Deal. That's a fact. If you look at it in terms of spending, in terms of government power, bureaucracy, we've had more and more wealth redistribution from the government every year for, in a big way at the very least, since the New Deal. I mean explicit to individual wealth redistribution, not counting all the indirect subsidies, that sort of thing. Obviously, the elites don't have a problem with wealth redistribution. The Democrats explicitly campaign on this, and they get elected on that. They get to office like this. They legislate in that way. So do the Republicans. Perhaps you don't remember, but Bush passed Medicare Part D, which was basically almost about a third the size of Obamacare. Huge redistribution, giving out loans to people to buy, poor people to buy homes, causing a housing bubble or contributing to a housing bubble, on and on and on. Okay, then he goes on. But child labor laws, the Civil Rights Act, federal income tax, minimum wage laws, Social Security, Medicare, food safety, Libertarians have accused all of them as an infringement upon the market. That would lead to economic ruin. And over again, they've been proven wrong. Life goes on a little less gruesomely, and society prospers. I was just reading Thomas Sowell today, and at one point he says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. That's a famous quote. He says something to that effect. If you're going to make a really, really important assertion, you have to be able to back that up. The assertion here is that life was terrible and it became better and prosperous, and the reason is these government programs he lists. The only evidence here is correlation. In fact, there isn't even correlation because society was becoming more prosperous long before any of these things he mentions came into being. The rate of progress in no conceivable, measurable metric increased as pace with these, so it wasn't like things were getting better and they passed child labor laws and then they suddenly jumped up and became even better. There's no correlation whatsoever. Any other, and that's only an implied argument. He doesn't actually even explicitly say that, but that's the only thing that I can even see in terms of an argument here. Civil Rights Act, by the way, is completely misrepresented. The Civil Rights Act did not give us affirmative action. The Civil Rights Act basically said the government can't be racist. That's all it said. So you had all these governments in the South, but all over the country, really, that were racist, that had laws that said, basically Jim Crow laws. And the Civil Rights Act said you can't do that. Now, this is not an example of the government making life better. This is an example of the government making stuff worse and then undoing the harm. That's it. The Civil Rights Act doesn't say anything about making blacks equal. It doesn't say anything about them having the same income or the same kind of jobs or going to school in the same. That all came later as a result of legislation more than a decade later, and also regulations that slowly formulated around. This is like if the government smashes your car and then rebuilds your car and then saying, hey, the government made life better. No, the government was horribly destructive, and it picked up its own pieces at a cost, of course, so still there's a net loss. Federal income tax, I'm not sure how that made life better. This country had already basically become by far the wealthiest country in history without the federal income tax. Minimum wage laws, same thing. Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. It's going bankrupt. It is bankrupt. It causes moral hazard. Medicare, same thing. Food safety, that's the big myth. People who read a fictional book by socialist propagandists think that they're reading a study of society. That's like a libertarian citing Atlas Shrugged as a definitive source. It's not. Anyone who questions that, I recommend the book The Triumph of Conservatism, about the Progressive Era by Gabriel Coco, who is not a libertarian. He is a Marxist, but all these regulatory barriers that the state put in were put in there for the favor of big business, for capitalists, not for the little guy, not to make things better for consumers, but to make entrenched, established money interests that much wealthier and secure by eliminating competition. Then he goes on to quote an economist: "There is no such thing as a free market," economist Ha Jun Chang has said repeatedly. "A market looks free only because we so unconditionally accept its underlying restrictions that we fail to see them." All right, now he quotes this Ha Jun Chang several times without making any arguments as to why his statements are true. There's no evidence that they are true. I've never heard of this guy before. So I decided to look him up on Wikipedia, and I found nowhere in there did it say that he is God and omniscient and everything he says is true. He is a Marxist who believes in, or he was trained by a Marxist. He believes heavily in interventionism, which would be known as corporatism, or even fascism. And this is something that apparently the author believes libertarians are unaware of. The idea being, look, capitalism only works if you have the government, enforcing laws and building infrastructure, and he probably include education and defense and a whole bunch of other stuff, basically everything he likes. Libertarians and libertarian economists are very well aware of the interconnected nature of society and the mutual exchanges that take place to make it happen. And they do differ here because there are some who believe there are a few things that the government needs to do. There are minarchists, there are the Milton Friedmans and F.A. Hayeks of the world, even the Ludwig von Mises of the world, who think that there are certain things that must be provided by the state. Typically defense, enforcement of law, especially contracts, and those are the big ones, but sometimes you might get roads or education, depending on who you're talking to. However, that does not mean that whatever government program you can think of is justified. It just doesn't follow. Secondly, the type of libertarian I am, and the kind that has grown tremendously in the last couple of years, would disagree with that and say, look, it's true you need law, it's true you need order, it's true you need infrastructure and all that, but it's not true you need the government to provide those things. And that is just a fact. You don't need the government to provide any of those things. You don't need the government to, in fact, historically speaking, everything they're talking about was created in pre-state societies or non-state societies. And they've existed in societies that either had states that didn't practice them at all, so there are states that didn't have education yet people were still literate, like the United States, for instance. In fact, the United States was extremely literate, more so than it is today on that, before the government decided to educate everybody. Although at the time it was really more about indoctrinating people. Okay. Blah blah blah. He basically, so capitalism has always been a product of big government ever since the railroads of the 19th century. Interestingly, he says has always been the product of big government, and then qualifies that as ever since the railroads of the 19th century. Now, maybe he's not a historian, but he should realize that always is a more expansive term than since the 19th century. All right, the 19th century began 212 years ago, and always goes back to the Big Bang. He lists a couple other things, blah, blah, blah. He basically lists corporatism. Look, libertarians are against corporatism. And, these same things that he's listing here that the government supports, he also snide about them being rich. And then somehow that's libertarians don't understand. This is just, he's basically venting here. That basically he says, universal health care, we can point to dozens of wealthy democratic societies that do that. So the fuck what? Just because other countries do it doesn't mean that we should or that we could. Obviously, there are physical differences between other countries. There are ways that they are just different. Also, just because they do it doesn't mean that's the optimal way. Those democratic socialist countries that he loves so much, they don't have free speech. They don't have the right to bear arms, although I doubt he'd care about that. They don't have freedom of religion. They don't have that much wealth. They don't have any upward mobility whatsoever. They have rich elites. They actually have people who are greater social elites than we do, because a lot of them, most of them actually, are monarchies, which supposedly he's probably in favor to as well, since they are, I mean. Then he says that General Pinochet's Chile was a libertarian favorite. No, Milton Friedman went there. That doesn't mean libertarians like it or think anything. Then he quotes Ludwig von Mises saying, "Fascism and similar movements aiming at the establishment of dictatorships are full of the best intentions, and that their interventions has, for the most part, saved European civilization." You know, talk about out of context. Actually, within the quote there, when he says, "to the best of their intentions," is, oh, someone's knocking on my door. Who knocks on your door at a hotel? Anyway, basically, Mises is saying, look, they have good intentions, but they didn't succeed. The other thing is, this is in the context of the Red Scare, of the communists taking over big chunks of Europe. And the communists were destroying Europe. And this is definitely a lesser of two evil arguments, where you could say, do I want to go red or do I want to go brown? And I mean, those are both shitty options, but if somebody says, well, I'll pick brown, that doesn't mean they're endorsing brown. You know, if you pick Hitler over Stalin, that doesn't mean you're endorsing Hitler, really. So, then he talks about your jobs. He's talking about work. He goes, libertarians don't give a flying fuck about your liberty. Instead, they condone the most brutal of tyrannies, all in the name of private employers' freedoms. And then he lists them: racial discrimination, verbal abuse, random drug testing, body searches, sexual harassment, illegal termination, email monitoring, union busting, even withholding piss breaks. Ask any libertarian how they feel about workplace unfreedom, and they'll tell you. How is, even just granting all that stuff, how is that the worst, most brutal of tyrannies? Wouldn't the most brutal of tyrannies be, you know, governments committing genocide and killing hundreds of thousands or millions of people, not allowing you to go on a piss break? This just shows an absurd degree of hyperbole on this guy's part. And to conflate the employee-employer relationship with the tyrannical government over subject relationship is completely ridiculous. I mean, just completely ridiculous. I mean, I don't know what else to say other than, I mean, if you don't like any of those things, you can quit, but that doesn't mean you're going to be like liquidated, which is the case with government programs. And even if the government isn't going to kill you, they're going to tax you and throw you in prison. You know, so those are the non-tyrannies, just kidnap you and throw you in jail. I mean, this is just absurd. Okay. Free market capitalism actually requires a huge mass of unemployment. It's not just a side effect. Yeah, and then he says that free market capitalism can never lead to, quote, full employment. Nothing can ever lead to full employment, nor is that an ideal, because some people might decide they don't want to work for a while, in which case they can be perfectly free to do so. A lot of people maybe only work seasonally, which they can be perfectly free to do so. A lot of people will be between jobs, not because they got fired, but because they want to get a better one. And when that happens, you will not have full employment, and that's not bad. This comes from Keynes, but it's absolutely absurd thing to think that we have to have full employment. So there's always going to be voluntary unemployment, or people would just rather not work, and that doesn't mean that they're lazy necessarily. It just means that they have other options they'd rather pursue. And then he says only the welfare can cure that. The nanny state can give you full employment. Only the way it can give full employment would be to institute slavery, because if there were people who didn't want to work and you wanted full employment, then the state would have to basically draft them and make them slaves to stop them from being unemployed. So that's a wonderful thing to advocate. Involuntary unemployment is basically not possible on a free market, because there wouldn't be any wage and price controls, and you would be able to find a job doing something. And then he goes on to say that with the government, you'll have higher wages and blah, blah, blah. And that's just not true, okay? At a time in which our society has never been more independent in every way possible, except for now you get taxed for not paying a corporation to give you health care. Now you need a passport even to go to Canada. You have to go through all manner of regulations to do just about anything. The government spies on everybody. And this is Obama now, not just the evil Republicans, spies on everybody, arrests anybody they want, secret trials, secret abductions, secret assassinations. Yeah, this is just totally absurd. Now, the other thing here is we're the freest and most independent we've ever been, but yet there's the shady power elite. So apparently, the shady power elite is all-powerful, and yet all these things the government has done has been against their will. It's a weird, wacky conspiracy theorist. Blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to read that. Basically, he praises Denmark without quoting how much they get taxed or that they have a police state. The welfare state is a check against servility towards the rich. Absolute bullshit. A strong welfare state would give us the power to say fuck you to our bosses. This is the power to say I'm going to work odd jobs for 20 hours a week while I work on my driftwood sculptures and play keyboards at my chillwave band, and I'll still be able to go to the doctor and make rent. This is just so wrong. It's unbelievable. All the welfare states that he lauds, they have fabulously wealthy people. And in some places, if you look, they'll say, well, the income differences are less in the United States. That may be, but the actual wealth disparities are usually the same or even greater in a lot of European states. Nope, there is no upward mobility in those states. There is a double standard. The politically connected always have better health care. They always have better living standards. The other thing here, we all can't just do our own thing, whatever we want, and then have there be doctors. Because who's going to be the doctor? Who's going to build, like, we all can't do driftwood sculptures and have MRI machines. Somebody's going to have to work to make the MRI machines, assuming that people want MRI machines. You know, if there's a demand for MRI machines, then somebody's going to have to do more than play their keyboard and just chill out all the time. And then the question becomes, well, how are we going to get people to become doctors and to build MRI machines and scalpels and you know, produce the energy necessary to power healthcare facilities? There's only two possible ways. One is the political means, and one is the social or the market means. The political means is you force them to, aka slavery, or you pay them what they, you know, you make a mutual exchange where they say, okay, I'll do it for X, and X is usually going to be money, but not necessarily. There's no libertarian rule that says it has to be. So this is kind of just him living out his dream without any kind of discussion of costs. I mean, they can't just gavel and have there be more goods available. I mean, they can't just say, okay, everyone gets their own beach house on their own private island. I mean, they could pass a law that says that, but in order to get that, they'd have to basically attack and wipe out all the people on little islands and then give them to Americans. And I mean, so it wouldn't just be like You know, the healthcare costs enormous amounts of money. The people in Europe have to pay very high taxes to get what they have, and what they have is not a service. Hundreds of thousands of people die in the UK every year because the NHS just decides they don't feel like treating them anymore. Many more die there because of that than die here because they, quote, don't have insurance. So another thing, just to kind of sum up here, he never defines libertarianism. He never defines the elite that is supposedly pimping it out, although there's scant evidence of that. And he sort of conflates it with republicanism, although he does not conflate whatever his ideas are with democratic, the Democratic political party, even though by his own reasoning that would be the case. He never he basically says libertarianism is like socially conservative, or socially liberal but fiscally conservative, and that's actually not true. The most important defining characteristic of a libertarian is the non-aggression principle, or at the very least, a concentrated effort to decide when force is acceptably used in society, on which libertarians do disagree. The being okay with drugs is ancillary to that. The being fiscally conservative is being ancillary to that. The being anti-government is actually a symptom of that, not the main reason. You know, we just look at government and we see all this aggression. And the retort to that is never that it's not really aggression, but to justify the aggression and say, well, it is necessary. But then the arguments for why it's necessary are so absurd as to be infuriating. I mean, it would be like saying, I don't know, that Hitler had to kill the Jews because they were asking for it. That's just not an argument. Or he had to invade Poland because he was getting surrounded, since the Jews example is way overused. He had to surround Poland because, or he had to attack Poland because he was surrounded by the British Empire. You know, just like Bush had to attack Iraq. Otherwise, I mean, that's probably a really good example. Bush had to attack Iraq. Otherwise, Saddam would have nuked us. That's totally absurd, and hundreds of thousands of people died because of it, and so that's outrageous. Well, people tell us that the government has the right to be aggressive, to be, you know, to rule over us in a very unegalitarian way. Not that he mentioned egalitarianism specifically. And then the reason that we should be okay with that is because if we didn't, you know, we'd all die, we'd all be poor. And these arguments are just so absurd as to be, I'd say they're laughable, but they're more infuriating than anything else, because you're having people advocating basically your enslavement based on a whole bunch of stupid dogma. And that's actually conservative dogma. It's that they grew up with learning in public schools, and that they are now aping like good automatons. So I guess I should be happy that this is kind of like the best that there is in general in terms of attacking libertarianism is this. He strawmans the whole thing by not even defining it, by basically assuming that the whole entire argument of libertarianism is based on a single pole. He also goes after Nick Gillespie. I don't agree with Nick Gillespie on everything, but attacking him is not the same thing as attacking libertarianism. In the comments section of his article, actually a lot of people were on there, and there was a lot of Ron Paul debate, and basically it was alleged that Ron Paul wasn't really anti-war, that he was actually secretly undercutting Dennis Kucinich, and that Ron Paul was actually a warmonger. Yeah, that's how delusional some people are, apparently. And Dennis Kucinich can kiss my ass. He tried to ban all handguns in the United States, and then he caved in on Obamacare. He was in a position to say no to that, and he gave a huge corporate subsidy to the welfare, to the insurance companies that before the day Obamacare passed were considered satanic by most leftists. Now they support their wholehearted tax-based funding. So fuck Dennis Kucinich, and there's absolutely no basis whatsoever to conclude that Ron Paul is not actually pro-war. I think that Ryan Doherty is absolutely correct that Ron Paul is a living, breathing rebuke of liberals and leftism everywhere, because their anti-war stance, their belief in civil liberties and the right to smoke weed and all that is totally out the window as soon as Obama gets elected, and then he can bomb and kill as many people as he wants, including people who smoke weed for medical reasons, because they get killed and arrested all the time on Obama's orders. That's okay. He can do all those things just as long as he gives welfare out. And that is a disgusting ideology to have, and Ron Paul is consistently against it, so he infuriates liberals in that way. So leftists are retarded. The whole idea, if your whole argument is going to be because you can cite polling data, then you're a fucking idiot. For you to even think that that's convincing argumentation just shows, I mean, you didn't even learn the scientific method when you were in public school. So there we go. That's it. I'll put a link to the article if I remember, and I guess the sun's going down, so I should probably stop. So.